All right. Good morning, dude and dudettes. All right. So, everybody knows one take. What we're going to be talking about today, Unit 5.5. Unit 5.5 is the interesting perspective of supranational organizations and international organizations. So, simplistically, we need to know what these mean. Inter meaning interconnected, right? Going together. Supra meaning above, right? Above, essentially super, right? Bigger, above. So when we're talking about these organizations, we need to understand what they are, what they do, and who they impact. The main aspect for this perspective, Unit 5 is more in the economic perspectives of politics. So we're going to be focusing on the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, essentially a organization that looks at the finances or the economies of countries, typically smaller countries, and I guess give them recommendations on how to better their economies. Let's say that. And then you have the World Bank. And the World Bank is the financial assistance. What they're doing is that they are literally giving countries loans, and those loans are preconditioned, right? So they're saying you have to do this or else you don't do that, etc. Things like receiving assistance is usually an agreement between the IMF, the World Bank, and the country, and typically what it does is that they're going towards that liberalization policies, like what we talked about. So what they're trying to do is essentially reduce tariffs, because that's going to better the world economy. Reduction of tariffs means less deadweight loss. Less deadweight loss equals more money into the pockets of people and governments and businesses, theoretically, right? So the ending result is that they're trying to reduce government subsidies of domestic industries. They're trying to reduce tariffs. They're trying to privatize a lot of the state-owned companies. Generally speaking, what we're focusing on here is we're focusing on the pressure that is put on by these international organizations to push neoliberalist and liberalization policies onto other countries. Now, I'm not going to go and tell you all of the dirty laundry of these organizations. You can do Googling yourself, but I would say if you are a person that cares not just about the class, but cares about trying to understand how the world works, looking into the fun history of the World Bank and the IMF can give you some light onto this perspective. But the other perspective we have to have is going to be, you have one end of the spectrum, which is the IMF and World Bank, and then we have the actual opposite end of the spectrum, which is going to be a lot of countries actually don't want the IMF and World Bank. They are trying to do essentially developing their own industries. What they're trying to do is they're trying to reduce foreign dependency and increase the protective of their country. Now, this is typically going to work well for countries that have access to resources that most countries don't have access to. This benefit is humongous. You can then essentially control a market. The problem is if you control a market too aggressively, countries will just find ways to go around it. So an example I think would be, a good example would be durians inside of Thailand. Thailand is the world's largest producer of high quality durians. Specifically, a certain sect of durians are grown in the Chantaburi, Changsensao area, or whatever you want to say. Those are super highly demanded inside of China. So in the beginning, they were selling it to China for a high rate. China ended up saying, we don't want to pay for this anymore, so we're just going to buy the land and we are going to harvest our own durians. So it can kind of, it depends on how you do it. It works really well if done right. That is the other aspect of this. So on the aspect of international organizations and international economics, we have one end of the spectrum, highly liberalized, highly neoliberalist, which is international organizations like IMF and World Bank, and we have the opposite end of the spectrum, which is essentially developing your own industries, right? So that is the international aspect. Now we have the supranational. Supranational means above. The most common and easiest to understand is going to be the EU. All right, the EU is the European Union. They were created to essentially make the European countries have simpler trading agreements. The end result was that previously, prior to the euro, prior to the EU, a country that was prior to this would have to have both currencies. You'd have to have the French franc and the Spanish peso, I think. And then they would have to exchange currencies, which means both companies are losing money for exchange rates. And then you're going to have to somehow find a way to where you have to find people who can agree upon these trade agreements, knowing that some of those countries don't produce the same things. Poland produces incredibly different perspectives of economic value than Spain. So it made trading really difficult, and the economies were suffering because they were losing out on a lot of benefit. Some countries just didn't want to trade with each other, and that would cause problems. These currencies were really difficult. A country like Switzerland, literally you can take a train through in a few hours. It is such a small country. They have their own currency, which makes it very difficult to travel internationally, or even argumentatively domestically. If you're in northern Italy to Switzerland is a few-hour drive. That's technically domestically. That's like going from Chicago to St. Louis. It's nothing. So the EU was to minimize those barriers. And those barriers were for trade, for domestic, and for international tourism. The ending result was a huge benefit for the vast majority of countries. Obviously, a country like Greece went through a humongous issue. Previous to the EU, there's like Yugoslavia. That was a big problem. The overall ending result of the EU is this over the country's control agreement to say we want better trade agreements. So we are going to get rid of our own national currencies. We're going to adopt the euro. And on top of that, we are going to kind of understand that maybe I lose on this trade because I get a benefit on that trade. I'm not trying to always win. I'm trying to make sure that everyone in the EU has access to resources that other countries don't. And that's the reason why the UK leaving the EU, or Brexit, is a bit confusing because they benefited highly. Britain or the UK does not produce every single good. They have to import goods from France, from Spain, from Germany. And once they leave the EU, they're now going to get a worse rate. So that's why Brexit was seen more of an immigration issue than an economic issue. Yes, we could argue that they lost a bit of their sovereignty. Every single country loses their sovereignty when they're going into a supranational organization because naturally you don't have full control over your economy and full control over your policies anymore. You have to listen to the EU's policies. But the end result for the vast majority of countries is a benefit. Obviously, the smaller a country, typically the more benefit because they're getting better trade agreements. So potentially we could argue maybe the UK being the biggest or one of the biggest countries in the EU, economically speaking, would receive massive degradation if they did not join the EU. And the end result is that they left and now have had some suffering when it comes to trading. Shortages on food, etc., etc. The other two areas of this class that are relatively important to focus on is going to be ECOWAS, so the Economic Community of Western African States, which is Nigeria. Same concept as EU, except it's not as political. It's more just purely economic. And then you have the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is very sovereign heavy. They are a sovereign power over your national government, and they don't have to be your friend. They are simply saying, we need you to change your trade policies. We need better policies to help the world economy. And you kind of need to listen to us. It is a interesting perspective if you want to research into it. The WTO has some fun, again, history, just like the World Bank. But the overall idea is to reduce tariffs and liberalize trade. Make sure that everybody on Earth and every single country can get access to resources. Overall, that's what most supranational organizations are trying to do, is to make sure anybody inside of their organization is able to have access to all of the resources that they need to get access to. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. See you later.